Okay, everybody, welcome to the lost track now. Are we on the third or fourth, Eric?
I think this is the fourth.
The fourth now? Well, we're really getting some under our belts. This is another live stream with myself, Steve, of Plug and Play EV. You know where you are because this is the channel. Eric over at News Coulomb, who has joined us via his Bolt Wi-Fi hotspot. So this is the latest and greatest GM technology. And very happy to have an extra guest today, Walter, from the Networked Architect channel. This will all be linked down below, and whilst Walter's talking, I will be able to pop up some links to his channel. But Walter has some experience with the topic of, well, one of our main topics today, the Flying J and Pilot Ultium Charge 360. A lot of that is going in his area. So, Walter, without further ado, I'll pass over to you quickly for a bit of an intro and tell us about yourself, your EVs, and where you come from.
Happy to. Steve, it's a pleasure. And Eric, you guys have been forging a path that you probably aren't aware is affecting lots of people who are new to the EV space. Your content is always wonderful, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. So for EVs, my channel was basically based on computer technology, specific data networking, and it turns out that there's not a lot of hunger for IPv6 tutorials. So I was just kind of doing it because I thought that there was a lack of content from professionals, but it turns out it's just not very popular content, which was fine. You know, I just made it. It was fun. And then I started to produce some EV content because it was a passion of mine, and I enjoyed creating the videos, and just having them in YouTube was a convenient place to store them. So really that was what I was doing. I mean, if you have family videos, you can store them on YouTube, and it's like free storage. You can either mark them private or mark it public. And so I would just mark them public, and was going about my EV journey, which started with my wife getting a Tesla Model 3, which I was kind of against. I'm like, why are you getting an electric car? But it's one of those things that once it's there, you're like, well, let me see what this is all about. And it turned out to be interesting. Her buyer's remorse was almost non-existent with the Tesla. And I think people will attest that if you're new to EVs, one surefire way of getting in with as little buyer's remorse as possible is going Tesla, just because they really have a slick ecosystem. It's not, the cars are really not the greatest. The cars are manufactured by engineers. So they're very stark and minimalist. And that's kind of something that they spin to be a positive. But anyway, the ecosystem as a whole, though, the chemistry of the batteries, the technology underneath the hood in order to ensure that the car is reliable, and of course the charging network, which has been built out methodically over probably about, I guess it's close to a decade now, really makes for a pretty painless EV experience. Later on, we got a second EV, which was a non-Tesla, because my wife liked the idea of having something a little bit more bulky that we could haul things around, get the kid to and from school. He was getting ready to go to college. And so we added a Volvo to the mix. And once we had that, the first road trip we had was a bit of a disaster. She was driving and she was very frustrated that the speed of the charging was poor, and it didn't have as much range as the Tesla, and there were fewer chargers. We went on PlugShare to a charging station, and when we got there, there was nothing but empty posts in the ground. There was no charger. She was very upset. And so I kind of helped a little bit, but really it was her thing. So I was just kind of letting her fail, for a better, lack of a better term. And so she vowed never to take that car on a road trip again. And the Tesla we had was a Model 3 long range. So anytime she went on a road trip, she just took the Tesla, and that was her thing. But I started to become engrossed with the Volvo because for me, the experience of that challenge was engaging, and the technology underneath the hood was very new, I guess is a way of saying it. The deathly silence inside the cabin, the ridiculous acceleration. I don't know if anyone's been in a Volvo, but those things are not calibrated for easy. You put the hammer down and off you freaking go. They are ridiculous in the torque that they have. So I really started to become more and more passionate about doing electric vehicle road trips. And I started to venture out into areas where EVs really shouldn't belong. And I figured out a way to glamp. And I was glamping in the back of the car, had a way of doing a 1 night, 2 night setups, and started doing exploring. And that was a hobby that developed. And I just started doing YouTube content over it. After a while, my wife was finding that the Model 3 that she was doing road trips in was causing her discomfort. We're older and our bodies are a little bit more prone to aches and pains. And Teslas, being as stark as they are really not that comfortable of vehicles. So she asked me for some recommendation of what to include instead of a Tesla, potentially trading it in or getting a new one. She wasn't quite sure. So I gave her a list of cars, and one of the ones on there was a Cadillac Lyriq. And then I just kind of quietly left it for her to decide. And she was running down the list, and then she's like, well, I kind of like this one, the Cadillac Lyriq. I'm like, what? I didn't say it, but I'm like, good luck.
Well, yeah, I would say you're certainly one of the first people outside of the kind of, the press folks, and even the press folks seem to have had some trouble.
I know. I was dumbfounded. So she's said, well, let's just go and talk to them. I'm like, okay, we'll go to, we're going grocery shopping. And I'm like, all right, we'll just go to talk to them. We walked into the dealership, and they had a car out front, which they use for test drives, which apparently dealerships were required to maintain. But they had one in the showroom, and we were talking. We got there about 9 o'clock in the morning. We were talking to the salesperson, and we said, well, is this one for sale? And she said, yeah, actually it was brought here yesterday, and the person who ordered it chose not to go through with the order. And I was looking at it. It was beautiful car. I mean, just really beautiful. And I knew the Cadillac had a 102 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is ginormous. And we asked her how much, and she told us the price. And I was standing there. I'm like, wow, I'm positive General Motors is losing money on these things, because we paid 63. Their base is 58. And there was a couple of add-ons that the previous person who ordered it tacked on, which were bigger wheels. And so for $63,000, and Kyle Connor's review kind of mentioned this, it's not as expensive as a Mercedes. It's more than a Model Y, but you get so much EV for that. 102 kilowatt hour battery pack, and we take it everywhere. You can't drain that battery. It's a huge battery. Mm-hmm. But that aside, you get so many creature comforts on the inside. The seats are comfortable. My wife's aches and pains, that problem has been solved. And heated and air-conditioned seats, 33-inch OLED display, ambient lighting, which the Teslas don't have, a sunshade. So like I'm on a road trip right now in a Tesla Model 3, and it's 100 degrees outside. I'd love to be able to close the sunshade, but you can't do that in a Tesla. In the Cadillac, you can. So all that being said, we're now a 2 EV family. We sold our last internal combustion engine car last weekend, and we have a Cadillac Lyriq and a Volvo XC40 Recharge.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a good moment to go all electric. So Tom in the comments, PCs and EVs channel to go and check out after this one, he's a driver of a Genesis GV60. Did you have a comparison there? Was there, it's a smaller vehicle, I guess. The Cadillac seems to be much more spacious, but how many did you cross shop in that kind of bracket?
Yeah, so it really wasn't me. It was my wife.
Right.
I was kind of a passive participant in this purchase decision. She asked my opinion about electric vehicles that may be available. And really what I was recommending was another Volvo or a Polestar, because she knew those seats were comfortable. I'm like, well, if you know those seats are comfortable, let's just stay in the same brand and, get a Polestar or, so I was pushing for a Polestar too, but she kind of had her finger on the Lyriq. And so it was her decision. Okay. And I think we're going to be happy come tax time, because it is full 7,500 on the Lyriq.
I'm struggling. I just did the Polestar 3 video because they had it up in the Polestar space here in Boston. Based on what you've covered there and what I've seen in your videos, it's, aside from the performance aspect, which is obviously quite important to some folks at Polestar, it's hard to see a $30 price delta between those vehicles. I mean, obviously you can spec up the Lyric as well, but it takes a lot to get it to that 80,000 kind of break point where you're not getting the federal tax credit anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think they'll have, until they can get that price down, the Lyric, if they can make them in great enough quantities, will be the kind of go-to luxury vehicle.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, Walter, you and I had a similar experience in that, I bought my Bolt EV because someone else fell out. So my reservation didn't actually show up at the dealership. And so when I showed up, they had one that was spec'd identical. The only difference was the paint color, and their financing fell out. So that was the whole reason I got basically essentially a day one, other than that promotional 3 delivery they did in October, the first deliveries of a Bolt EV. But the other thing I would say about the price too is, don't underestimate. According to their literature, GM said that they got the finished pack price down to $100 per kilowatt hour for Ultium. So that Lyric battery might only be costing GM about $10 to $12, maybe $15,000. So I mean, it's a good portion of the price, right? But that's why you can get a different spec Cadillac gas-powered SUV for $50,000 or $40,000. So that's probably where that difference comes in.
And on the battery pack here, watch this subtle segue into what's your charging profile like, Walter, on the Lyric?
Well, the debut edition, which is the one that we got, it comes in a couple different flavors. And so first there was what they call the debut edition, which was basically the same as a luxury trim, a luxury 2 trim, I think is what it was. Comes with a 19.2 kilowatt AC onboard charger. That's what it came with. And there's some debate whether or not that was all they had on shelf stock, and so that's what they threw in there, or if they're bumping people up to a premium. Regardless, that's what we have. And I'm exploring the way of trying to get that into my garage, because I've got 2 circuits off my breaker, which I can combine into one 100 amp and put 19.2 in there. But I'm waiting for NACS 19.2 to become available. And apparently the Gen 2 Tesla wall connector can do 19.2, and that's what I have. But I'm a little bit leery on doing that because I'll have to use an adapter for the time being. Anyway. So AC wise, 19.2. DC wise, it's fickle. And I think what's going on is Kyle Connor says that the pack is split. And apparently, if your AC is on, it starts to draw from one side of the pack and makes an imbalance that causes the DC fast charging to be affected. And that's the best explanation I've heard. Or they're purposefully making it super conservative in order to not repeat the bolt fire situation, which may or may not be true. Honestly, I don't know, but I do know that DC fast charging in the Lyric is not clean. It's not a clean slope as you would expect. Some people have reported that they have seen clean slopes on the Lyric going from 190 kilowatts, which is what it's rated for, down to what you would expect, maybe about 110 kilowatts at 80%, something in there. But what I'm saying is you go up to about 180 and then you drop down to 90 at a very precipitous event. And then you stay at 90 and then there's some jagged issues. I'm not going to hold that against them. Everything I hear is that that's going to be corrected in over-the-air software updates. So it's not been an issue for me.
Okay. So that peak is going to, once it gets sorted out with the charging curve, 190 is a pretty nice
sufficient. Yeah. It's not 800 volts, but it's good.
It's close enough.
Yeah, and I think that might be part of the problem, right? Is the Lyric is one of those 500 amp current charging cars, and so we're still, and I'm going to leave this segue up to you again, Steve. But we're still seeing a dearth of 500 amp. Like for Tesla, it's easy in their native connector. They're doing 750 amp over their V3 superchargers. But for CCS, the cap is that 500. And for charging providers like EA, Electrify America, they're still only a few of their stations are really 500 amp, and a lot of them even now are the split power 350 kilowatt, which means you're sharing that 500 amp with another station. So getting that max power is going to be really difficult in a car like Cadillac, and a car like BMW, and a car like Mercedes, all three of which are part of that charging consortium that's looking to build out the 350 kilowatt charging. But the other thing that I would note with that too, Walter, and this is what I was going to say, where I don't know, Kyle might be right, might be wrong. That might also have been the GMC Hummer EV with the split pack he was referring to. But
he referred to the Hummer and the Cadillac both. He thinks the pack is similar for the.
Oh,
it's, it's not as big in the Lyric as it is twice as big in the Hummer, but it might be similar in the Lyric.
Yeah, because my understanding is they're basically the Lyric is a half Hummer pack. So a Hummer pack is two Lyric packs together.
Yep, on top of each other.
Yeah, but even aside from that, if there's something similar going on to what I've observed with the Bolt EV, is observing the charging curve affects it. So if you have the car on and you're monitoring, the charging curve that you see is different than if you leave the car off. So it changes the parameters for when battery conditioning kicks in, for when it throttles power. So those things change based on whether the car is on or off. And I think that's part of what we're seeing from a lot of the people who are reviewing right now, these GM EV products, is if they turn the car on when they're looking at the power curve, and then they're seeing fluctuations and dips and drops. And I think that's a lot of what's going on, is if you turn the car on, all of a sudden it says, oh, you must be getting ready to go. Let's cool down the battery. Let's cool down the cabin. Let's start cycling. Let's pump all of this stuff. But if you leave it turned off, it's like, oh, you just want to charge? We're charging. So I've seen nearly a 10 to 15, almost 20-minute difference in the Bolt EV charging to 80% when the car off versus the car on. So I wonder, that's my assumption right now with what you might be observing with the Lyric. But like I said, getting back to that 500 amp, Steve, if only there was someone building a network of 500 amp chargers. Sorry, that's the segue.
That would be helpful. I mean, it would be really nice if there was someone with a map say, wait, what's that? Something behind me there. Walter, I think I came to your videos through, it was either through the Lyric that we've, as we've been discussing, or the Flying J pilot, because a lot of those are going in your area, and you've done some great videos visiting the sites, looking around, kind of sketching out where those are going to be and what kind of layouts they've got. We want to get into that, as the topic of this is the future of fast charging, and this is the Ultium Charge 360. On paper, looks like it could be a significant addition. What are you seeing so far? Where have you been? And I can bring up some video if we touch on some of the locations here in a sec.
Please, yeah. So first of all, I'd like to take a step back just very briefly to see how we got to where we are, because I personally think what's going on is GM is making this story up as they go along. I don't think this is, it's not going to be the first time either. The decisions we see today that are actually coming to fruition are things that have been decided on a couple of years ago, because we all know that when you put a DC fast charger in the ground, it takes eons in the impulsive modern age of what we would expect something to be completed in. There's permits, there's transformers, which are major long pole. There are all kinds of things. So the ones that we see now were engineered probably 2 years ago and are actually now coming into the ground and getting ready to be lit. Also, if you look at the map behind you, it says Ultium Charge 360 on the wrap, if you zoom in really tight. But what I'm seeing is that EVgo stations are getting new wraps, and they just say Ultium. So I don't think the name of whatever this is, it's not a network. It's not a consortium either. Actually, I think what happened is General Motors is coughing up money from somewhere, either from their profits or from government subsidies or something. In order, see, it says Ultium. So I think what's going to happen now is EVgo is going to be rebranded as Ultium in some extent. An Ultium partnership, I don't really know, but that's the name of the technology that General Motors uses for their electric vehicles. So I don't think the network, the partnership, the consortium, whatever we want to call this thing, is going to be called Ultium Charge 360 going forward. I think it's just going to be known as Ultium, which is a big win for GM because basically they're taking over EVgo. And I think what happened was the EVgo Renew initiative was being funded by General Motors quietly. And all of a sudden they started putting all these wraps on all at once. I'm seeing these all over. Like all of a sudden, EVgo chargers that have just been in existence for a long time are all of a sudden getting wrapped Ultium. But the ones that I've seen at Pilot and Flying J are, as you mentioned, close to my house. And I think what we have is a two-prong approach. The Renew initiative was in major metropolitan areas in order to accommodate people who live in multi-tenant dwellings, in order to have charges during the normal life cycle. And then the Pilot Flying J initiative was to take care of road tripping. So it's a two-prong initiative. The ones on Pilot Flying J are supposed to be competing with the Tesla Supercharger, and we could stare and compare which one is better. I do think that I'm on a road trip right now because Tesla's been in a mad rush to survive. They've been very snap judgment in their location picking. And oftentimes you'll be in the back of a parking lot, even worse than Electrify America. You'll be way in the back of a parking lot, no amenities whatsoever, no restrooms, no garbage cans, and you're stuck there for 30 minutes while your car charges, and then off you go. These are very deliberately located at locations that are open 24/7, 365 with full amenities. So they definitely have that going for them. And what I have seen is that right now, I know of 4 locations that are close to my house, and 1 more showed up on PlugShare in Missouri. So I think what's going on is these are all starting to come up quickly, and I think we're going to start seeing these popping up like daisies on PlugShare as people start to see them.
For sure. We'll touch on a little bit in a while here because I didn't realize, but a good proportion of Ohio's NEVI funding from the first round actually went to EVgo and Pilot Flying J. It was much bigger than I had initially thought. But so that's a piece. But you're right to step back a sec because there are some different. One of the things with EVgo is there are many programs going on. So you have Renew, you have EVgo Extend, which is technically the umbrella under which the Pilot Flying J program is going on. Okay. So it was announced in July 2022. So that I think you're right on that. That is their overarching travel corridor. You know, that's going to be the prime kind of candidate for NEVI funding before NEVI funding was really a thing. So they've certainly timed that well.
And sorry, go ahead. Apologies for interrupting, but I just heard yesterday on Transport Evolved News, the weekly news report, that NEVI funding numbers have been released, and the number 1 charging network for receiving NEVI funds is Tesla. Okay. The number 2 is Pilot Corporation. Mm-hmm. So they're definitely receiving funds.
And that's, I think, an important distinction with that Extend program is this is technically, these are Pilot's chargers.
Right? Okay.
So unlike if you see an Ultium Ready site, and that was the original branding, I think, was the Ultium Ready for these chargers. If you see one in a random retail outlet or whatever, those are generally owned by EVgo and operated by EVgo. The Pilot ones are going to be technically owned by Pilot, but operated by EVgo. So it's almost like they're leasing a gas pump, except this time it's a charger. So.
Yeah, I heard Travel Centers of America were doing something similar with Electrify America's partnership in order to have their equipment on their site, and they were going to operate them, but Electrify America was going to take care of the back-end systems.
Yeah, they all have a slightly separate approach to it. Electrify Americas will be called Electrify Commercial in a lot of occasions, and then so EVgo tends to make a program or an initiative for it. It seems so they all have a different way of doing it, but you can. And they usually says, as Eric says, on the awards, who has been the recipient, and you'll typically see in almost all that I've seen so far, it has been, as you say, Travel Centers of America as the Recipient or the Loves is another one, Pilot Flying J. So those will be the, but they'll also say the hardware provider and the network as well. So there's a lot of moving parts in there. But, what it comes down to, we can get into the weeds with those, and obviously we're interested in it. End of the day, as Anthony says, Pilot Flying J stations can't roll out fast enough, because that is that nationwide network, that kind of, you can see it behind me, it's covering a lot of the routes that Electrify America already covers, but also, some extra locations as well as all the metro areas. And this is the competition that Electrify America lacks. We obviously have a big change coming up next year that we'll start to get onto a little bit, and how these things are going to align with the future of fast charging. But these networks that are being mooted, the Super 7, whatever you're going to call it, the Hyundai going out on their own, Mercedes-Benz, whoever's going to try and do it, this is the one that's actually starting to get awards, equipment in the ground, and we can go and check out these sites. So it's probably the furthest along before you start to get Tesla superchargers, opening up more widely, and, with the vehicles with the other standard coming along. But these are, this is going to be one of the ones that we're able to use most, in the near term, I would guess, So if I go back to that, and Eric, I'll want your opinions here, of course. This site is one of the ones that I visited when I was down in Walter's neck of the woods, a little bit further north in Virginia, Harrisonburg. So it's still awaiting a transformer, this site. And actually, although obviously I'm really glad to see that hardware, I wasn't super impressed with this site just by virtue of the lack of, if I go back to the start there, there's only really 350 kilowatts. I mean, maybe this area it's on along I-81. It's kind of in the middle of that Virginia stretch. And simultaneous charging obviously means that you can potentially charge 4 CCS EVs at once here. But, that's not the kind of one that I think a lot of people are envisaging. I think, Walter visited a site that had the canopies, that looked a lot like a gas station. And that's the kind of thing that I'm really seeing as kind of the future, pull-through parking, amenities, all of the things that we're talking about here. Eric, what do you think about that kind of disparity between something here that looks pretty much like a regular EVgo site, or even smaller perhaps, and the ones that are this kind of future charger?
Well, yeah, I was actually going to kind of reel back just for a second. Like, first, I wanted to say thank you, Walter. I feel extremely validated, because I've got a lot of flack over the years, because I've mentioned that here in California, probably the older networks, right, 10, 12 years, like you said, that superchargers have been in the ground, but also that EVgo has been in the ground. And I caught a lot of flack because early on I said EVgo's site placements were actually more compelling than Tesla's. Now, Tesla's superchargers, there's no arguing. You have 6, 8, 10, 12, 150 kilowatt split power superchargers, and compare that to 2 50 kilowatt chargers in the ground. There's no comparing the site from a charging perspective. But when you're right next to a restaurant or a coffee shop, or like where EVgo placed their chargers, they've always had that, right? And I feel like whenever we talk about networks moving forward, Steve, the two factors that I always look at first are coverage and concentration. And early on, EVgo is doing that okay. They were decent coverages in the regions where they were covering. They were the reason I was able to make 1,000-mile trips in my Bolt EV in California 6-7 years ago. So down to San Diego, all the way up to Northern California, Highway 101, all through the state. But that was regional. This national push for coverage is only going to come through this Flying J initiative. But then you get to that site concentration. How many chargers do you have per site? Because 6-7 years ago, 250 kilowatt chargers in the ground in the middle of California, there was nobody there. I had the site to myself 90% of the time. Now, if you have less than 4 chargers or 6 chargers in California, you're very likely to be waiting in line. And that's with 150 to 350 kilowatt chargers. So I think you mentioned something in the title of this stream about future proofing. I do worry about those sites that only have the 2 nose in 350 kilowatt chargers. Yes, technically they are 4 active 175-ish kilowatt chargers. So you are going to push cars through very quickly, but that's a very small throughput for a site that's supposed to be pushing forward this really like rapid expansion, and it's at a pilot and there's no pull through, which is one of the big factors that we were looking for. So I was hoping for more than what we're seeing from these pilot build outs, but I also wonder if the sites that we're going to see in high traffic areas like California, or possibly where you are, Steve, along interstates in like the New York, Pennsylvania area, we might see much larger sites than this. But yeah, I would really want to see no less than 6 to 8 to 10 stalls per location. And even in these more rural areas, only having 4, that's kind of iffy to me. So
I do wonder how many of these will come down to the NEVI criteria as well, because the sites that we're seeing as awarded in Pennsylvania and Ohio are much more, the town where they are, it's usually half a mile off. It's not even a town. This location is essentially a pit stop. So those travel centers are much larger than these kind of, this is just a gas station that I showed in Harrisonburg there. But the ones that I'm seeing pop up in the NEVI funds are much, much more sprawling truck stop kind of locations. And that's where I can see the kind of sites that Walter's visited showing up, with those more gas station-like amenities. How do you feel about the future proofing, Walter? What are you seeing that is giving you pause for thought, and others that maybe the other side that really makes you kind of excited for the future of these rolling out?
Yes, thank you for asking. And I think what we're looking at, as I said, is the result of decisions made several years ago. What had to happen, I think, in order for the 4 locations that are close to my house to actually have occurred, was General Motors first had to make this decision about the Ultium branding, the partnership, the 2-prong approach, as I mentioned, and then seek a method for funding the road trip charging solution that they felt necessary in order to spearhead. Petitioned federal government, got law passed, and are now proceeding. The problem is that that knockout punch that they're in the process of swinging is swinging at someone that has now moved on for years, and the EV landscape is now different. So the NEVI standard, as it currently exists, our power sharing is permissible. So you could have 350 split between 2 150s or 175s. That's permissible. So what we're looking at are NEVI sites. There needs to be 4 CCS plugs. NACS is not in the NEVI standard. The NEVI guidelines. In order to receive funding, it has to be CCS. So we're looking at a slow-moving train wreck where we're in the process of proceeding with an implementation plan with decisions that were made multiple years ago for a landscape which has now shifted and moved on. So in my personal opinion, that's the most serious problem. As far as road tripping goes, generally you don't need as many stalls as you do in the people who are trying to just fuel up on a routine basis. People who are charging at home, you charge 2-3 times a week, something like that. And people who are living in apartments also are going to charge 2-3 times a week. I think the heavy hitting for charging will be at those EVgo renew stations that are in major metropolitan areas where there's generally larger number of chargers, and the road trippers are just zipping down the road and getting some juice and going on about their business. So it's a little bit different use case. So I am concerned about the number, as Eric mentions, but really what I'm concerned about more is that we're in a technical paradigm shift with government bureaucrats trying to help us. And I think the end result will be capitalistic forces will fix this problem. Companies like Circle K, 7-Eleven. Around us, we also have the headquarters for Circle K. And when they're doing build outs in our locations, what they do is they put in 2 ABB chargers at 180 kilowatts, but they build out for 4. So they know they're trying to keep ahead of it. So they're each location that they build is capable for 4 dual handled 180 kilowatt ABB stations. They put in 2, and then they move on and they keep going. And then as the congestion starts happening, they'll put in the 2 more. So really, I think that's how this is going to be solved. I don't think the initiative, as we're staring at it, will be a final solution. It will help, and it'll definitely be nice, if nothing else, in order to post up into a Pilot. And Pilot is the brand that has fast food, and then Flying J has sit-down restaurants. So as you're cruising down the road, if you're choosing between the two, you can choose between either fast food, and lots of times they're both at the same exit, which is kind of weird because of the conglomeration that happened. But only one of those two locations will have a NEVI site. So anyway.
Well, and Walter, just to counter off of that, because I think you're right. And if we want to play devil's advocate for EVgo, they might know where their usage is going to be, because if you look at their Ultium ready sites in larger cities, you're looking at 8, 10, 12 stalls per site. One of the ones I want to go check out in San Francisco pretty soon when they turn it on has, I think, 28 stalls. So split power 350 kilowatt stalls. So they kind of know where their market is, and I think they know where their highest usage is. You used to be able to see this on PlugShare. I think they've eliminated the option to look at that data, and the use time for their EVgo city chargers 5 years ago, they were in use 80-90% of the time. Their highway sites were only in use maybe 60 to 70% of the time. So kind of speaking to your point about that, like the highway sites don't actually necessarily need to be as large as the sites in metro areas and larger populated areas. But then the other thing is, for me, it's the configuration that keeps coming back to me. Is these are Pilot Flying J. I want at least 2 of those stalls to be full pull through, right? Where I can bring a trailer and I don't have to detach. That's what they're there for. They're travel plazas, not park your individual car in a single stall plaza. But to your point about NEVI funding, I worry about that too, because when that NEVI funding was announced, I saw a lot of networks just completely stall. They stopped building chargers. And it's like, well, why did you stop building chargers? Oh, we're waiting to see if we can qualify for this funding. We're waiting to see if we can get these sites subsidized. So these were sites that were planned to be put in, planned to be funded and moved forward, but they couldn't do it, or they could do it, but they decided to stop because of the promise of this carrot at the end of a stick dangling down however far down the road. And when you dangle $5 billion in front of these corporations, they're going to wait to see how much of that they can get for themselves.
Yeah, there's a gentleman named Brandon Flash who is integral in the Circle K deployment. He actually works for Circle K, and he's also a big YouTuber. And he actually chimed in on a chat saying that the NEVI funding will start to be released in the first part of 2024, and you'll actually see the NEVI stations start to pop up middle to second half of 2024. So we could start to see a lot of construction going on. And then it's a question of how much supply of DC fast chargers we actually have in order to capitalize on it, which is going to come to my second point, which is a bit of a news flash. I was getting ready to drop a video about this, but Kempower has set up shop in North Carolina in order to start building DC fast chargers for the North American market in North America. And there's 2 locations in Eastern Tennessee from a company called Zeph Energy, which has been a partner for Kempower. And I'm getting ready to go visit those because I'm very interested to see, are we looking at a Kempower participation in the capitalization of NEVI funds or not? And I think the answer is yes. And boy, that would be nice, because Kempower's got their act together for sure.
It'll be interesting to see where they slide in, because Zeph I encountered on my trip over to Wisconsin, Minnesota, mostly 50 kilowatt kind of hardware at the moment. The 2 installations I think are over there. There's one up in Michigan that's got a Kempower location somewhere near Ypsilanti. Then there's one down in southern Minnesota, but both of them limited to just a single post or a couple of posts, and they've not been full installations yet, and that's what people are really waiting for, I think.
And those came from Scandinavia. Those were manufactured in Scandinavia, but the plant in Durham, North Carolina is getting ready to start spinning up and spitting out DC fast chargers for the North American market in order to capitalize on the NEPI funds.
Yeah.
So we're
And I don't know if we were going to talk about this here, Steve, too, in the hardware, and maybe this is another one of those segues, because I have kind of mixed feelings about split power. And Walter, I think you and I chatted about this too at that recent road trip that you had in your Model 3, or I guess you're still on. But the running into throughput issues at a site level, right? When is splitting appropriate and when is it not? Because you see those two 350 kilowatt EVgo Ultium ready chargers at that pilot, they split power 175 kilowatt 4 ways, but that's it. And you are going to get that much power if your car is capable, even when all of the stalls are fully, occupied. But some of these larger Tesla sites, they run into power caps. And once you hit that power cap, the more cars that get added on, everybody starts charging slower and slower and slower. And that's kind of the Ken Power thing too, where you might have 8 posts. And I know people are going to blast me for saying this, but you take a Chevy Bolt EV and you take 8 of them, you can max out a Ken Power site. But if you take 1 or 2 Hyundai Ioniqs or Tesla Model 3s or 250 plus kilowatt chargers, they might both max out as long as the rest of the stalls aren't occupied. And that's where
it's a little bit more nuanced with Kempower from what I understand. From what I understand, what they do is they also look at the state of charge of each vehicle on each post. And they don't do just like an even balance where it's like a pool and everyone gets the same. They actually do much more dynamic allocation of power to the different posts. But you are right, it is shared.
Yeah, to me, that's when is it appropriate to do that? As many stalls, as many parking spaces as you can get, no matter what the cost and ultimate charging speed, versus when do you want to guarantee that if I pull into a stall with a GMC Hummer EV towing a 30-foot trailer and I want 350 kilowatts of power, how can you guarantee that I get that, right? And that's right now we're not seeing. In my opinion, I don't think we're seeing the charging providers put enough thought into when you put this charger into the ground and you're either going to split power or not. Like, what is your thought process, and what are you thinking the consumer is going to want when they pull in it? Are they going to want for sure stated power, or are they okay? Steve and I have talked about this a number of times. Traveling with an EGMP car, you run out of time. You want to sit down and eat and you can't, right? You're in and out of that stall in 20, 30 minutes. If you come in at a high state of charge, you're already literally at 100% after 30 minutes in an EGMP car. And it's like, I just got my food, right? And sometimes you'd be okay splitting 40, 50 kilowatts of power across 8 or 10 stalls, because that's what that stop is meant for. And I think even Steve, you might have mentioned this too. I think Kempower might also support this, is the idea that you can pay for the power level that you want. So if you do want to charge faster than you can. So I see there's value in it. I'm just wanting to make sure that these charging providers have that in their mind when they put these into the ground, and kind of account for how consumers want to interact with those chargers.
I think there has been a race to just get the biggest number posted, right? I mean, the up to 350 kilowatts, the 360 kilowatts, going up to 400. I mean, this is all well and good, but there's a point where it tailors to the site as well, and the dwell time. We'll talk about it in a little bit. What we hope to see from whatever the networks that we choose to stop with are, and the price you would pay for that. But some flexibility in this tamping down. I know no one wants to think about slower charging, but there are plenty of places, on more regional trips where I'd really like to linger, whether it's because I'm at a meal with the family or because I am, looking to explore for 30, 40 minutes, again, plug for Walter's road trips. Some of the stuff that Walter sees there is, you can, even from some of these, national parks kind of rest areas or welcome centers, there are trails right there, and maybe level 2 would be a bit slow, but I might choose 25, 50 kilowatts if I want to go and hike for, an hour or two.
Or even level 1.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a potential here for these kind of things. And I think that, to go of course we want to get faster and faster, and of course we'd like, to be able to say to the gas folks, we can charge, basically the same amount of time as you. But there's got to be some kind of calibration here, and if it's at the flexibility of paying a little bit less, even at these highway stops, I think there's something to consider there.
Yeah, I think the NEVI requirement that they dispense at least 150 will placate the situation that Eric is describing to some extent, where if you pull up to a NEVI location, you're guaranteed at least 150. And I'm sure there's lots of Lucid owners out there with signet surge issues who would love 150 after they spent $120,000 on a Lucid and they can't get more than 50 kilowatts out of an EA station. There's many things occurring in DC fast charging as we speak, trying to get ahead of the curve. I think, unfortunately, we're fated to be behind the curve for a couple of years, but at least the future looks bright.
Sorry, I'm jumping into the comments here and there. So if you see me on mute and typing away, that's why. I'm still very interested in what you both have to say, but I'm also interested in the folks the comments are putting in here. So yeah, Anthony kind of, counters my point, and I think that makes sense. Throughput needs to be maximized. No benefit to the public to have charges occupied by someone who wants to linger. Yes and no. At highway sites, if we see charging as a scarce resource, yes, I don't disagree. But that it has to be matched to dwell time, because there are places where it is suitable to have a lower power level, and it only matters if that stall is occupied. If you can't get somebody else on that charger. But if we're building enough chargers, and if we're getting enough in the ground where, this speaks to some of Eric's kind of trips where there have been multiple options and you could go across the street to a charging station just as you can with a gas station. If there's a line out of one, you go across the street. Maybe not me tying up a 350 kilowatt station because I want to go and have a stroll, but certainly enough charging hardware, or the variation in the types of charging hardware, as Walter said, whether it's a level 1, level 2, whatever we can get in there, something that is aligned to the use cases at the location, because again, these trips to national parks, these kind of things, I want something that charges my car. A level 2 might do it, but we need something that is going to take that 1 hour, 2 hours, and maximize the space that you're taking up there. So I think it needs to be a little more thought out than just put the fastest hardware you can, most powerful hardware you can in the ground, get people through as quickly as possible. There's more nuance to it than this kind of, maximum number that we keep on obsessing over, I think.
Well, and so this is an interesting thing too about this EVgo and then the Ultium hardware, and maybe speaking to your point too, Walter, about the NEVI funding, is that a lot of that EVgo original chargers had 100 kilowatt delta in addition to, and so you really saw right now it's basically three pieces of hardware: either the Delta 100 kilowatt 200 amp, or the Signet 350 kilowatt, which do not split power. They are dedicated 500 amp, 350 kilowatt units. And then the Delta split power 350 kilowatt units. So you basically have those three units, but on these newer sites, I have seen fewer and fewer of those 100 kilowatt chargers. And I think even Kyle Connor, and rightfully so, has called out a few of these EVgo sites where you have 200 kilowatt chargers stacked into 2 parking spaces, where those are technically split power units. Sure, you're only going to be splitting 100 amps, and typically it's a CHAdeMO cable on the other side, but wouldn't it be nice to actually be able to facilitate that, especially with Tesla owners who still, a lot of them actively travel with the CHAdeMO adapter, giving a Model 3 or a Model Y owner the option of charging with 50 kilowatts on CHAdeMO as well. So we're seeing fewer and fewer of those 100 kilowatt chargers And it's possibly the NEVI funding that's responsible for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the site owners are restricted by existing parking layout, and it won't be for several years before we see ground up builds of EV charging stations. And I wonder if someone would come up with the concept of pole barn indoor EV charging stations, because there's no exhaust. You can just go inside and be free of the elements and shoot some hoops or something like that. And no gas cars allowed. Thank you very much.
North Dakota.
Yeah, they got that?
No, I'm saying that's where they would.
Yeah. So
imagine traveling I-90 or I-94 through the Dakotas in the middle of winter and being able to pull off to a heated indoor, charging. I mean, you probably need a graded floor to get rid of the snow and ice, but still.
with pull through, as you say, because it's built from the ground up for EV charging, and park a food truck there or put in a convenience store or something. But I think with the existing retrofitting that is occurring, there is a certain amount of limitation just in the sheer layout that they're trying to retrofit these things. But hopefully, as you say, there'll be more deliberation in the engineering of these sites in the future.
So let's see what I'm missing on our list here. We touched a little bit on timeline, and as you said, Walter, Brandon pointed out, we can expect to see hardware start to get lit up next year, most likely. Now, I know a few people on the channel have said, can we expect to see anything in 2023? It's just not how quickly these things move. I mean, the announcements for round one are only just being made through summer, and a lot of these have potentially the whole of 2024 to get these things in the ground. So the map will look very different. It's already starting to look, if you look at Ohio and Pennsylvania, those are big changes there. But as those round one awards start to come out, the turnaround time could be anything from 6 months on the optimistic side to much more like a year. So,
yeah, I recently watched an EVgo site, and sorry for digressing, get lit in downtown Charlotte at a place called Archdale Plaza. I think it's the name of the location. And there were two 100 kilowatt locations put in, obviously for people who were in multi-tenant dwellings for daily charging. And it took forever. This is not an instant gratification exercise. So, as you say, funding will be released, and I understand the long pole is the implementation of the transformers, not only the hardware getting installed, them getting integrated into the overall grid, I think is a back-end exercise, which also takes time. So you put the actual transformer in, but then for it to actually be lit on the grid is a long-standing process. So that plaza took, from the time it was first spotted to the time that it actually got lit and in use, I think about 9 months. Mm-hmm. And that means the hardware was in place. It got spotted. And then 9 months later, which means the engineering for that began even further in the past. So I'm thinking 18-month timeline sort of thing. So once someone says go, an 18-month clock starts clicking.
Yep.
Well, and Walter, you see this on the supercharger info map where but what's happening is people are sleuthing for permits. So they're looking for different sites and seeing where they're permitted and what their address is, trying to figure out who the provider is, that sort of thing. And we're not really seeing that right now. And EVgo in particular, they own PlugShare. I think they're omitting a number of their sites that are either in design or even starting construction.
Deliberately.
Yeah, yes. Deliberately. I think they are masking a lot of the sites that they have that are coming. And I think you had mentioned your experience with your wife, right, where you show up and the site is just holes in the ground or conduits or whatever. I think some of it might be to alleviate that because you don't want someone to toggle on coming soon sites and show up at a site that's under construction and not powered up. But I think some of it is just, they're just trying to intentionally mask these sites that are coming out. But if you go to PlugShare and you filter by EVgo and you filter by over 200 kilowatt, you'll see quite a few of these sites that have already been deployed throughout the country, to the point that we're actually just maybe a half dozen sites short of being able to comfortably drive across the country on I-70 right? In just solely using EVgo and no other charging network. So it's getting, work is happening, right? So
the timeline has lit up the comments. Well, there's 4. But I'm just remembered I can put them on the screen here, so that's a good way for us all to focus on individual ones here. So Anthony asks, is 2024 the year we go back to the happy times of available superchargers, Nevi, Flying J, etc.? I think it's early. I think, I mean, from my side, I think everybody will want 2024 to be the focus year. I do think it's going to be significantly better than this year. But remember, all this time, we've got 9-12 months between now and the next major kind of summer travel. All that time, more and more EVs are being deployed on the road, right? So we're still we've definitely tipped, in my opinion, from what I'm seeing on the road, at least the ones that we travel. The availability of stalls has, been overwhelmed by the new EVs coming out, and I don't see that tipping, at least in the first half, and possibly not even in the second half of next year. What do you guys think?
I think I am never happier traveling in my Bolt EV than I am when I never visit a supercharger or an Electrify America site. Being able, I say that kind of jokingly, but in all seriousness, when I have the opportunity to skip over Electrify America, I do. And it's not has nothing to do with not liking them as a company or anything else. It's that they are more likely to be full than an EVgo charger or a ChargePoint charger or any of these other smaller regional networks. FreeWire Boost chargers are almost always open, and you're paying 35 cents a kilowatt hour flat fee without a membership. It's hard to argue with that. And so if you have the opportunity to skip over some of these more crowded networks like the Supercharger network and Electrify America, I feel like travel can actually be a little bit more easier. That's just my opinion. But
Walter, what do you think? Is that California situation where there are multiple providers potentially at every stop? Is that coming to the East Coast? Are we going to see that next year? How do you feel about the progress that's coming?
Yeah, I think the sad state that the OEMs needed to come with hat in hand to Tesla in order to gain access to the supercharger is causing a massive backlash of retaliation by them against Tesla, and their pockets are far deeper. So yeah, Tesla is I'm not going to call them a startup, but they're not an OEM. They don't have the funds that a Ford, GM, Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen Group has. They just don't have those funds. So I think what you're seeing is a deliberate retaliation on their part in order to put a non-Tesla network together quick. And I think it's going to happen. Mercedes is putting in their first site in Atlanta, and they say October, a little bit more than a month away. I looked on PlugShare, I didn't see it, but they say the first site is going to go live in October. There's that. There's Hyundai just announced. There's the consortium, unnamed consortium. There's the Pilot Flying J. There's the EVgo Renew, which is being funded by GM to some extent because they're wrapping the damn things with the word Ultium. There's a large retaliatory response to the situation that developed with the OEMs having to come to Tesla to gain access to the supercharger in order to get through the initial portion of the S-curve adoption. So my personal opinion is the future is bright because they can't tolerate their customers going to test the supercharger stations for much longer. And I think they're going to fix it. And as I said, also capitalism, I think, is going to start playing a role here as well.
Well, and to that point, Walter, too, though, the Mercedes originally penned a deal with ChargePoint in a similar way to GM's with EVgo. So I think those stations are still greenlit, and there were at least 200 in their initial build out.
Yeah, and first one's supposed to go in in October. So
So I've just seen how close we are to the hour mark, so I'm making sure I hit as many questions as we can, and then we can discuss how much time we have left. I know Walter's in a hotel traveling, and Eric is out on dinner time on the West Coast. But we should answer Alan and Tiffany Yates here. Do you think there are states holding their RFPs for round 1 of NEVI to see how the response goes for early states? I'm going to turn that over to you guys.
Yeah, I didn't realize that states have authority to determine how funds are dispersed. I thought it was federal law, but apparently with the Texas thing and the NAC requirement, they do have some leeway, and I don't understand the intricacies of that. But as is being suggested, there is significant oversight that these states have with the disbursement of these funds, and politics being what they are, and desire of states not to be ruled by the federal government, have independence, is definitely going to have a play here, and we'll have to see how it pans out. I know in the state of North Carolina, things seem to be clipping along at a pretty good rate. We're kind of an EV-centric state currently. There's a little bit of back and forth with the Republicans and the Democrats and all that fun stuff, but the funds are there, and DC fast chargers are going to ground. So I do think it will be different per state.
Well, and Walter and I had a little exchange about this too. I think you mentioned the politics of it, and what I see on the ground level and the consumer level, politics has nothing to do with EV adoption, right? But once you get into state level politicians' offices, that changes. And there's a reason West Virginia is so far behind in their public charging infrastructure, and they've been sitting on millions and millions of dollars for years now. And so when someone from West Virginia tells me, well, we don't have your infrastructure, I can only say, well, have you spoken to your state representatives? Because they're the ones who are really the ones that can make that happen, because the state is sitting on funding that they're not acting on.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't put too much on the delays. I think each state works on its own level, and we've seen some are just very proactive. I'm kind of surprised that Ohio is so far ahead in the announcements, but I think sometimes people are just ready to roll. I don't expect that to be a big story or a big delay, but yeah, I think we're waiting for certain states more than others. West Virginia is mentioned in the comments, North and South Dakota, Montana, those are all key locations just in terms of their dearth of fast charging right now. I'm personally looking at Maine because their state program has been exceptional for what they've got with the limited funds of Dieselgate for that initial state awards. So if they've bridged some of those gaps already, but there are significant areas up to Canada and Nova Scotia that I'm waiting to see bridged, and I'm interested to see if NEVI funding does that for that state. But I think we'll all have our local kind of, areas that we're watching closely, and I'm kind of glad Pennsylvania and Ohio have announced, because it does change the map in Pennsylvania significantly, especially I-80, that route across the state, which is 300 miles. That's kind of behind my head somewhere here. But, it's significantly bridging a lot of those. Electrify America was the only game in town. They are frequently, not down, they're just congested. There's not enough stations and at one point the Sheets was demolished, to be upgraded in a key location, and that's it. You can't travel that route anymore until the Sheets, deems it fit for use again. So there are locations like that I think are going to be, just stuck up in red tape a little bit, but I don't see any particular, reason for them to slow to watch what other states do. I think each state has its own kind of pride and wants to forge on its own path.
Well, I was going to say, just look at Michigan really quick. I don't think that that's a coincidence that home to Ford and GM, and their infrastructure is blowing up right now. So,
and definitely a place that is again, but between them, New York and Maine, those are states that I look to as kind of exemplars of effective state level funding going in places where they know the state, they know the locations that need to be bridged, and they're working very hard. We're just up in the Adirondacks in Lake Placid and going back next month, and that would not be possible without Evolve New York. For as much as they've been criticized for spending the money in lesser trafficked areas, these are places that would not be served by Electrify America, EVgo, or any of the existing providers. So I think we've got all the comments in questions, at least, there's a mention from Anthony of John Voelcker's excellent piece for Charge DVs, which is actually a 4-part series, 3 of which have been published at the moment. Speaks to Walter's point about the pushback and the OEMs kind of being scared into the fact that, you know, they really can't put all their eggs in Tesla's basket. So lots of good stuff in there. I'll link that down in the video description. Gents, again, I can never get this under an hour, so apologies. Is there any closing kind of thoughts? We'll obviously have to have another one to come back and talk about all kinds of related future fast charging topics, but closing thoughts.
Well, I did want to say one thing about John Voelcker's. Well, I've only read the first part. I need to go back and read the other articles. But he had mentioned something about 97% charger uptime not being sufficient. And I just wanted to say, because they actually took EVgo's metric, so they didn't use the one that Tesla had been publishing, and none of the other networks were providing their uptime metrics. So they actually used EVgo's, which is based on a charger by charger unit. And he had mentioned that a 97% charger uptime isn't sufficient. And I would say I would push back on that, because it's all dependent on how large your site is. Because when you think about it, if you have a 10 charger site, you can have one down for 10 days out of the year. The likelihood that you show up at that site and there are even 2 chargers down is very, very low. And that is actually approaching, in my experience, gas station level reliability, where you typically will have at least 8 to 10 out of the 10 to 12 pumps working, but not necessarily all of the pumps working.
Yeah, I've kind of seen this conflated a lot, where, you know, the Electrify America reputation gets put down to, okay, so derated chargers or one charger not working means that the entire station is down and you can't travel. Those two are one and the same. That frustrates me, because I think it's, although we have to address and acknowledge the difficulty that Electrify America's, you know, lack of performance in many areas has put on the industry, and maybe it's catalyzed us, so maybe it's, in the end, it'll be good. You can still, you know, I haven't made these trips across the you know, across half the country and down to these national parks on, you know, look, it's not me crossing my fingers as I roll into a station. It's a good bit of planning and, you know, essentially being able to charge. Is the experience perfect when I get there? Probably not, and I've got plenty of videos to come on that. But, you know, the fact is you can still do these things, and uptime is one thing, but being able to get a charge and get away is another. And I think that's going to be a nice way to kind of bookend this here, because, you know, this is what we need from these sites. We need this, even if that uptime isn't perfect. You know, there are still things we need to do to have enough stalls and enough providers. And if one's dropping the ball, you go across to the other, you know, and that kind of circles back to where we are with crossing our fingers and really hoping that this map behind me is just one of many that gets rolled out next year.
Well, and I think it circles back to Walter's initial point, is I think EVgo's goal needs to be as good for the consumers as the Tesla experience. And I mean, that right now, I think they might be falling short of that, but it's a good goal to have.
I'll tell you right now, I've got 2 cars that are non-Tesla, and given the choice, as you said, I would prefer an EVgo station over a Tesla supercharger any day of the week. I got plug-in charge. I've got more reliable, sustained rates, and better amenities. So looking at where my charging dollars may rest, if I have a choice, I would probably choose EVgo currently. And the flood of ones that appear to be getting ready to pop up at Pilot Flying J's just adds to that even more.
There you go, host sites. The money's waiting. Just build reliable chargers and have amenities that we want, and we'll be knocking down your door.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's gone over again, but this is how we typically do it here. So next time, one time, will be below 60 minutes, but not this time. Walter, thank you for joining us from your road trip. I know that's always a challenge. And Eric, thanks for demonstrating how capable the Bolt TV's Wi-Fi hotspot is.
Yeah, and we have PG&E flying over checking the line, so I might have power soon.
Well, there you go. Next one will be fully equipped. All right. Thanks a lot, gentlemen. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you all in the next one. Thank you, everybody. And make sure to go and subscribe to Walter's channel, The Network Architect. I've got that link below. Obviously, News Coulomb as well. And you're already here. So thanks, everybody, for watching. And we'll see you in the next one. Good evening.